Merry Christmas, everyone. VenomousStare returns with another exceptionally exciting edition of the Venomous Classic series, a series in which I take a look back at classic StarCraft II games and sort of contextualize them and just make sure that everyone who obviously wasn't around 10 years ago is able to actually partake and enjoy in these. I would be very, very surprised if you've seen these games before, so let me explain them. This is the MLG Dallas 2010 Finals. And this is played between two exceptionally talented macro players. The one on the right of Metalopolis here is Liquid Jinro, and the one in the top left is TT1. TT1 is a French-Canadian player, and a guy who really comes from Brood War, as does Jinro. Now, whenever you consider StarCraft players' history, and sort of their careers as a whole, I want you to think about it like baseball reference. Think about a StarCraft player's career and it going year by year, just like on the website Baseball Reference. It's, if you're not aware, just like an online sports almanac. So think about it this way. Jinro and TT1, if you looked at their baseball reference, or their StarCraft reference, I guess in this analogy, it would have started way back in like 04, 05. Both of these guys, or maybe even before that, but the point is like mid to early 2000s. These guys are old school. These are really talented guys from Brood War. Jinro played under the ID Frozen Arbiter in Brood War, and in Day 9 Daily's 100 episode, which is a much-watched video for any StarCraft fan, he talks about how he actually practiced with Jinro in some of these tournaments. Jinro and him were practice partners, which back in the day in Brood War, you didn't really just ladder, because there wasn't a built-in in-game ladder. What you actually had was third-party ladders like Icy Cup and I think it was called like PG Tour, yeah. And essentially the way these worked was you would kind of hit someone and ask them for like 5 games and then go from there. There wasn't like a queue again, a play again button, and oftentimes people were sort of forced to develop relationships with other players, sort of develop a friendship, have this guy as a practice partner, and even if you really don't think much of his skill or much of his style, you would find yourself playing against the same people way more than you would ever in StarCraft 2, in terms of you sort of had to like arrange a meet, almost like it was a drug deal, to get games sometimes, especially quality games. And this led to situations where you had guys who would sort of become long-term practice partners with each other, and this is how really Day 9 and Jinro's friendship was established. Was if you just consider the fact that in StarCraft 2, people were just constantly spamming play again. Customs really weren't nearly as big of a thing in StarCraft 2 as they were in Brood War. And this was a very interesting element of StarCraft 2 history. And by the way, these are the semi-finals. The way that the MLG worked back in the day was that you had to do this thing called extended series, which essentially meant that because there was a winner and losers bracket, whoever ran their way through the winner bracket got to keep their score going into the finals. So, for instance, if TT1 wins this is a best of 3, this semi-finals. If TT1 wins this, let's say 2-0, he would go and Jinro got knocked down to the loser bracket and won in the loser bracket and made it into the finals. TT1's score of 2-0 would remain in their best of 7. So he would literally start up 2-0 and Jinro would essentially have to come back at a huge disadvantage. And people really hated this rule, the early MLGs, the extended series. And in fact, there was actually this really funny Evil Geniuses joke video they did where Jeffrey John Vincent Robinson, rest in peace, especially on days like today, Christmas, these holiday times, you really have to consider what In Control's family is going through, not having that wonderful presence around. It's just very tragic. But there was this very funny Evil Geniuses bit where In Control basically was like playing a ball buster and was joking around and like flaming the other Evil Geniuses members. It's a very funny bit, still up on YouTube. And the extended series is what it was called, and it was a reference to this. this goofy rule that MLG had that led to a lot of sort of anticlimactic finals where it seemed like people really didn't have a chance a lot of the time because it was already a situation where the guy who made it through the winner bracket was the favorite, so the fact that the person who actually came up through the loser bracket had an even bigger disadvantage made it a lot harder to hype up as casters. So this is the semi-finals, and we are going to, of course, do the finals right after this in the same video. And if you're sort of worried, like obviously whoever loses comes through the lower bracket and makes it back to the finals since this is one big video, but you don't really know who wins yet, now do ya? And the great thing about this series is I really know that almost no one has seen these fucking games because I had to dig severely just to find them, and found them on this very esoteric small channel that hasn't posted in a decade, GG your face. Now it's interesting because whenever StarCraft 2 first came out, a shitload of people tried their hand at casting. As we can see, TT1 has a plethora of workers as Jinro goes for some Banshee harass. This is a very long video, so I'm not gonna so much like, oh, super into, you know, like calling every little play-by-play. Also, these games are from 2010, that's why it seems like it's going at 20 FPS. They are at the highest quality possible on my end. There's nothing I can do to improve source recordings. Now, if you're the sort of person who can't watch anything except like a 144 frame 1080p video, then I don't really think you can truly appreciate the Venomous Classic series. Because part of watching these old games is realizing that in 2010, open broadcast software did not exist, aka OBS, you know, the software literally everyone uses to stream now. People were having to do like weird things with programs like Fraps. I mean, Fraps wasn't that hard to use, but which is definitely not as good as OBS. And more importantly, like, oh yeah, like you could make Fraps look okay around 2011, but the way the rendering and the codecs on YouTube worked, it was really hard to get your videos to look really nice. So back in this time in 2010 though, it was like a monkey fucking a football. It was really the Wild West in terms of no one knew how to make videos look as good as they should. And as far as streaming goes, forget it. Pretty much everyone was streaming without webcam and commentary and fucking 360p. These were the Justin TV days, fellas. It wasn't even called Twitch TV at the time. And Jinro is doing his exceptional signature macro play where he forces his opponent to multitask, and we can see him using Banshees to great effect here, picking off pylons. And Artosis made this hilarious joke on GSL whenever a player was taking way too much damage to Banshees, and it's like this ongoing joke that he has when a Banshee does way too much damage. He'll go, oh, that's a Wings of Liberty Banshee. And the joke is that in Wings of Liberty, Banshees did way more damage than they do in Legacy or even Heart of the Swarm, because A, it was harder to scout, B, no one really knew what they were doing, especially to like the same extent. It was sort of an archaic time where people were figuring stuff out. People took way too much damage to Banshees, especially Zergs. Remember, Zerg had way less scouting ability at this time. The Overlord was way slower. The Overlord speed was locked behind layer tech. And it was just a brutal time to be Zerg. You had to make an Evo chamber to make a Spore. And there were so many things you had to worry about as a Zerg player that two-port Banshee was one of those things where it's like if someone has quads in poker and you like have a full house and you're like, well, if he fucking has quads, I guess I'm dead. That's how people sort of treated the Banshee in this time, especially Zergs who had a real hard time with it. And the Jinro player from Sweden, the beautifully and handsomely talented Gorilla Terran, is going to aggress upon the Colossi here with the air units and then come screaming forward with the bio, and TT1 throws up a Guardian Shield and a couple of panic fields, but whenever your Colossus gets sniped out by this heavy air mix, it was very, very hard to deal with. Players weren't really going for like as fast of a blink and charge at this time. You were really relying on your Colossus. Notice that Jinro hits before the attack upgrade and Thermal Lance is done, so this is an exceptional timing, and TT1 GG's. Also, that was game 1. This is game 2. So what you have to consider here, fellas, is that because of the way that that game went as far as the Banshee harassment and how Jinro retained them, it was very difficult for TT1 to hold the follow-up push. And let me explain that a little bit more. In the same way that people took way too much damage to Banshees in Wings of Liberty, people really struggled with their Banshee retention as well. It wasn't a strength that people had. People really would lose their harassment units for no reason. And one crucial element that we saw early on in Wings of Liberty was the Warp Prism was 100 HP, 40 shields, because Blizzard knew how grotesquely powerful that unit really was. But because people were so bad at using their harassment units and the game in general, multitasking, micro, macro, all of it was at so much of a lower level, what you really saw was people would lose their harassment units way more, whether it be the Prism or Medivacs. There was no Medivac boost at the time. But the Warp Prism only had 40 shields, and Blizzard was sort of like, well, we know Warp Gate is like really fucking good, and if people really use the Warp Prism effectively, like it'll be lethal. And that's something that we sort of saw come to fruition, was that the Warp Prism was incredibly good, and specifically the move that Protoss players would do versus Zerg, whenever they would have a Warp Prism outside the main base of the Zerg, and anytime the Zerg would push out, they could do a DT and Zealot counter. That was just an incredible move for Protoss. But the Ukrainian terror, Alexei White-Raw Fitzcomp, or Crumpler, I don't really understand how to pronounce his last name. It starts at the K and everyone loves him. But old Alexei White-Raw was like the only Protoss player making Warp Prisms in Wings of Liberty. And whenever, excuse me, whenever people come up with things that actually bleed into the future, things that have merit, they really sort of are trailblazers in the game. And that's the main reason I wanted to cast this series, is Liquid Jinro was the trailblazer of macro Terran. And what do I mean by that? Having a lot of chest congestion here on Christmas, sorry fellas. So what do I mean by that? Oh, he innovated. A lot of people, whenever they see these old Wings of Liberty games, and almost always these are people who have never been higher than Platinum League, they'll go, oh, these games are so bad. It's like a Gold League game now. And it's like, guess what? This was 10 years ago. This was a time where the fucking game came out and no one knew anything. And you know what? Because the macro mechanics were so much different from Brood War, people couldn't accurately apply a lot of the lessons that they learned in Brood War over to Star 2. There was no multiple building select in Brood War. If you wanted to make stuff, you had to click each building individually as TT1 expands here. TT1, if you notice, he very frequently goes for macro-centric builds, and this was very uncommon at the time. Usually, remember, this is 2010 early Wings of Liberty era. What you would see a lot of times from players was one base aggression into expansion. If you look at StarCraft 2 now, a lot of it is predicated on what's the most effective way to rush out an expansion. And you start with so many goddamn workers, it's pretty hard to get cheesed out in the early game. Back then you started with 6 workers. And TT1 and Jinro were two guys who were really committed to macro play when everyone else was cheesing. If you look at the map pool in the early days of StarCraft 2, Delta Quadrant, Steps of War, Lost Temple, maps like this, these were rush-centric maps. These were maps that really sucked for Zerg. These were maps that favored aggressive one-base play and had very short rush distances, as Jinro's clearing out his gold rocks here. And what this meant was aggressive play was better than macro play. And this sort of had a stagnating effect on the development of the metagame, because Terran specifically was very, very powerful. And what ended up happening was, because Terran got to plan all these absurdly small maps, and this was especially true versus Zerg, because of the way that rush distance works and how Protoss and Terran were sort of neutral in the early game in terms of, well, it's a close distance rush map, as opposed to Zerg, who always wants to be making drones and really wants it to be as long of rush distance as possible. But really what you saw was at the beginning of Wings of Liberty and in the beta, Terran players, it was so easy to win with aggressive play because of the map pool and a lot of other stuff, like how the patches were. Short stem timing, bunkers having a shorter build time and being refunded 100% with salvage. Blue Flame being more powerful. I could go on and on and on. basically Terran and those fucking 6-Rex Reaper openers with Nitro Pack. Terran had way more aggressive options. They could really punish and abuse you. So what this led to was a rise in players like Marine King Prime, who made the second GSL finals ever. And you know, as we see a robo going down, I can't really make it any more simple or make my point any more clear than this. In the second GSL finals ever, Marine King got to play Nest-T on maps like Steps of War, Lost Temple, all these abominable maps that we're going to see in the pool of this series. Delta Quadrant, Zelnaga Caverns, and what we saw was basically Marine King cheesed every single game, and the final game, oh, and by the way, like, not only are these maps bad, especially for Zerg, but you can spawn in close positions, and there's no neutral thing at the bottom of your ramp. That took literally like 2 years for Blizzard to figure out. So Terran could wall you in if you were Zerg, and there was this, I know I'm talking about Zerg a lot, but the metagame and the map pool really affected Zerg in a much different way than Protoss and Terran. The way that the meta affected Protoss and Terran, and really more specifically Terran, is that you had a lot of aggressive players like Marine King who got way higher and way better on the ladder than they should have been. Now, Marine King's not the best example because he was legitimately talented, albeit ridiculously abusive. Hyperdub would be a better example. Ensnare would be a better example. These were players who, after Terran got nerfed a couple times, you never fucking heard from again. Whereas, even though Marine King is the perfect example of that sort of abusive style and how far you could get with just being insanely obnoxious, he was actually, like, you know, good after Terran got nerfed. But the reason I brought up the Marine King example is it's Game 7 of a best of 7 GSL Finals, Marine King versus Nest-T, and holy crap, it's on Metalopolis, and they spawn in close positions. Should be an absolute death knell for Nest-T. Idra described close positions Metalopolis as worse than Steps of War because the rush distance is about the same, but the terrain is worse because there's like a huge fucking high ground basically overlooking your natural, which is actually worse than Steps because at least on Steps, your natural's on the high ground. So yeah, you can get Siege Tank pushed from the low ground on Steps, but you can't really get fucked in the ass in the same way. Anyway, I know we're talking a lot about the maps and stuff, but this is what it comes down to in these early 2010 games. So much of it is about maps. So much of it is about understanding how the patches and the players work. So to finally conclude my thoughts on Marine King, they spawn in close positions. Metalopolis should be a fucking auto win for Marine King. Nest-T has went an entire season dealing with ridiculous imbalance and really having to get lucky to win. And not to cut Zerg players down, because Zerg was the worst race for the first fucking year this game was out. And that had a lot to do with Zerg players developing their macro mechanics quicker than Protoss and Terran. Because even though everyone sort of had to figure out how to macro with the ability to make multiple camera hotkeys, more than 3, multiple building select, all this stuff that makes the game easier compared to Brood War, people are still figuring it out. So Marine King gets close. I promise I'll finish this thought. Marine King gets close positions Metalopolis, and what happens? He fucking goes 2-Rax Bunker Rush, and Nest-T narrowly holds, and like Marine King's retreating, and it's like, okay, well, it's fine. Like, Nest-T lost some workers. Marine King is just gonna go like back into his base. He's walled in. That was another big thing, is if Terran simply walled in versus Zerg and like kept a Marine on the perimeter, it was really almost impossible for Zerg to scout. That's how you could get away with doing things like 2-port. It looks like Jinro's third might get caught out here. But Marine King does another fucking big engagement here, as wow, TT1 really traps him with force fields, and it looks like he's going to crack this third base. As right when Jinro ventured out on the map, TT1, remember, was powering up on 2 bases. Notice how TT1 is like always double pumping workers even when he's doing extended 2-base play. This was, we see a drop in the main. One interesting thing is that, you know, this was an archaic time where a lot of times a player would make basic macro mistakes, like not constantly workering up. One thing we see with TT1 is he's really pumping those probes heavily, and whenever he does take a base, even if it's more delayed than you might be used to, you'll notice he always does like a big probe transfer. Like in Game 1, when he finally took his natural, we saw like an entire dozen probes transferred down. So after Marine King fails his bunker rush and Nest T like narrowly holds with the drone pull, you're thinking, okay, it's fine. Marine King's, and look at this, it happens to the best of us. Marine King's just gonna sit at the top of his wall and like Zerg can't get in. Pans over to fucking idiot Marine King's base. The dunce has built his fucking supply depots behind his mineral line. So instead of just being able to hide behind his wall and do like a follow-up push that's almost certainly gonna kill Nest T, he just dies because the fucking Lings walk in and he doesn't have a wall. This was the sort of macro mechanics that we were dealing with. This is the GSL, the top Korean tournament ever. And if you might be misled and think, well, maybe the Koreans weren't as good at the beginning of the game, maybe it took them a while to catch up. A, this wasn't true. And B, there were way more foreigners in GSL than there are now. There would be like a handful of foreigners in the first few seasons of GSL, whereas now it's basically like Scarlet and maybe Juanito, and that's it. Jinro, after getting his third picked off, is going to venture down into TT1's third base location and be like, oh, well, shit, you still haven't taken your third? Maybe I should have just chilled. But Jinro's really trying to micro these Marauders, and because Jinro doesn't have engineering bay upgrades, we're really seeing him struggle versus the Protoss ground army here, even though TT1 only has +1. So to conclude my thought about sort of the Marine King metagame development, I'll give you a great Idra quote that sums up the difference between Marine King losing on close positions Metalopolis with no neutral ramp so he can double bunker block people, and how Jinro played. This is a great Idra quote. He said, and this isn't verbatim, I heard this like 8 years ago, but it's very, very close. He said that you had players like Hyperdub and Marine King making it far in GSL doing abusive cheesy stuff. Meanwhile, Jinro actually failed the first 2 GSL qualifiers. He failed to qualify because he was busting his hump and trying to figure out how to play the correct way on these abominably bad rush-centric maps. It could have very easily been, you know, it would have been way easier for Jinro to do what all the other Terrans did and just cheese and abuse, tank drop on Lost Temples, 6 racks on Zelnaga, or 6 racks Reaper on Zelnaga Caverns, to do these abuses. As Jinro's going to lose his third again here and probably lose the game. And there it is. It would have been way easier for you to fucking do that. To sit there and be like, oh, well, you know, this build works, this is what's strong now, I'm going to abuse it until it gets patched. Players like Silver and Mask did this, and then whenever Terran got nerfed, they were literally never heard from again. And that's a big deal. And what happened whenever Terran got nerfed? Jinro was at his peak. Whenever the maps became more balanced, and Terran became a race that wasn't all about cheesing and abusing and these sort of like beta builds, you could call them. Not beta like beta versus alpha. I guess that doesn't really work either because there's also an alpha in a video game, but not beta like cucky, beta like before the initial release. So beta builds. Yeah, like really aggressive stupid shit like I was talking about. Jinro was not the beta build guy. Jinro was, how do I take my natural on Steps of War? And it took him a while to figure that stuff out because amazingly, if you just consider the history of StarCraft 2, remember, no one had any fucking idea what was going on at the beginning. And crucially, the very top tier of Koreans, Flash, Jaedong, Bisoo, these guys, they didn't switch to Star 2 right away. They were playing Brood War. They were saying, why the hell would I switch games? Excuse me, I'm king of the world. I'm god tier at this shit. I'm the best player in my game, at my craft. Why would I switch to an unknown game, StarCraft 2? It really took 2 more years, all the way to 2012, for the top tier Kespo, we call them, Koreans, to switch over. Flash, Jaedong, etc. This, of course, was really most famous when Jaedong joined Evil Geniuses, the North American team, because this was a legend, a god in Brood War. Even your casual StarCraft fan had heard of, joining a major North American team, by far the biggest North American team at the time, most popular. Players like Idra and In Control, I mean, that's like, you got 2 pillars of the scene right there. And the other 2 pillars of the scene are Day 9 and Artosis. This map is Lost Temple. It has a massive cliff high ground over the natural. it's really not as big of a deal in Protoss vs Terran, but in Protoss vs Zerg, we would see tanks and Thors dropped up on this high ground very frequently. That was sort of the go-to abusive build on this map, as we see another bunker on the high ground from Jinro. Again, this is sort of the basics of, oh, okay, how am I gonna just really do the very rudimentary basic concepts of, oh, not die to early game shit. How am I going to take my natural? These were the sort of things that people were still figuring out, as bizarre as it is to say. And because the players spawned close by air, Jinro does this little cheeky strategy just like he tried in the first game on Metalopolis, where he makes like the factory at the corner of his base and then tries to float it into the other player's base. And this is a, look at the guy fucking up his overlay, that's pretty funny. And this was like a kind of like a common just sort of slapdick maneuver, because mech units were seen as utterly worthless versus Protoss. There were no mines. So very frequently, especially players like Marine King who really loved bio, as soon as their factory was done, they would just float the damn thing and scout with it. TT1 going for another safe robo opener. We can see that both of these players are really playing similar in every game. They're not doing map-specific builds, map-specific cheese. We see like a one-gate robo into second gate expand from TT1. Notice how he tries to get that observer out quick to scout. And we see a Raven opener from our beautifully handsome Gorilla Terran. And the interesting thing about Wings of Liberty, I was talking about how it was harder to scout. If players were making stuff and they had a tech lab, the tech lab would grow up green. And even if it wasn't researching anything, the tech lab would still show up like it was researching something. So that's a good example of how it was harder to scout for the other races, not just Zerg. And a phenomenal use of the Raven, as the observer is immediately deflected and really didn't get very much scouting info. And again, Jinro's going to go into Banshee. And I just sort of love how the combo of the Banshee and the Raven work, because full salvage money back, by the way. Because if you consider the fact that the Banshee and the Raven really have, one of them counters the weakness of the other. If you can kill the observer with the Raven, it's going to be way easier to do Banshee damage. And even though we don't really see Cloak Wing went for here, that's because Cloak was 200 at this time, which was a huge investment off of one base. And if you're going for stuff like Stim and Marauders, you really can't afford that. So it's just very, very interesting to consider how this game sort of fleshes out, because since the Banshee Cloak has been made significantly more cheap, you pretty much get it if you're even going to make one Banshee, it's worth getting. But back in this time, Dark Shrine was way more expensive, Banshee Cloak was way more expensive. These were seen as very high-risk plays that would sort of put you behind if they didn't work, even though they were very powerful, and people made way less detection and would just die to dumb stuff more often. Little swapperino here for Jinro. So he makes the one Banshee this time before swapping, whereas on that first game on Metalopolis he made 3. Obviously, TT1 is way more on top of defending this than he was in the previous game. Jinro had such a huge impact on the StarCraft 2 scene with what he contributed to teaching people how to macro, because even incredibly talented Korean players weren't really trying to flesh this out as much as you might think. People were way more willing to just take the aggressive wins with the cheesy play. And speaking of cheesy play here, it looks like Jinro might pull a few boys, because aggressive play is just written all over this. We don't see an expansion, and vexingly, even observing was way worse in this time. People just were like obsessed with the units tab instead of the production tab. It's like Artosa said, I can commentate an entire game just looking at the production tab. It'd actually be way harder to do this in this era, because it's like what people really didn't even know what the fuck they were doing. But we see a little bit of a boy pull. This is just going to be used for repair, and it's very weird how we see these pre-medevac timings. Huge stim coming in, point defense drone going down. That's going to absorb a lot of shots, and Jinro's going to get absolutely filled with happiness here as he's going to break TT1. And again, we saw another timing where Jinro was really aiming to hit before TT1 had a critical mass of Colossus with upgrades. And this was a nice little win for Jinro, so he's going to win that, and then this is the finals. And that was fucking playing in the background for no reason, so... Remember, with the... we can see TT1 here, the French-Canadian. Here we go on Delta Quadrant. Another aggressive map, and look, the fucking quality's even worse. By the way, this one was on the official MLG channel, like poorly labeled and buried. And it's just sort of funny that like the GG your face guy, the random off of YouTube, was actually able to upload a better quality VOD. Sort of humorous, shows where you were production-wise back in the day. So this is a best of 7, and due to the extended series, Jinro is up 2-1. So just imagine, this is just the way the extended series works. Imagine it's best of 7 and Jinro's up 2-1. And all 3 of these games that we've saw have been very close and exciting. And it's very interesting that in a time where it was sort of like an arms race to see who could be more obnoxious and cheesy, both of these guys are playing completely honorable, completely standard styles, and really revolutionary styles, because, like I said before, the way build orders worked in like the first year of StarCraft, especially for Protoss and Terran, was like, I'm gonna do this like really aggressive one base push, and as I move out, I'll start my command center. And the thought process behind that was, well, if I do this like one base aggressive build and wait to expand, it'll be way harder to die to early game nonsense. But what this really equated to was, you were gonna cheese. It was like, oh, I'm gonna cheese, and if they cheese, it'll be even, and if they expand, I'll kill them, because people really hadn't figured out how to play safe. If you just sort of look at StarCraft and like if you look at StarCraft and like the classic RuneScape combat triangle dichotomy of like one thing counters the other, which counters the other, the 3 elements are greed, safe, and aggressive play. Greed is when you expand rapidly and play sort of unsafe to get a macro lead. Safe is when you do something, you know, safe and standard to make sure you don't die, sort of like how TT1's been opening, and Jinro. And then obviously everyone watching this knows what cheese is. It's like aggressive one base player, a trick. But what does that mean in this instance? Well, it means that it's way, way harder to sit there and say, well, what counters cheese on Steps of War? How am I going to stop this guy being aggressive in close positions Metalopolis? And that's sort of the problem that Zerg players had, was it was like, how am I going to take my natural when he can do a million different things and I can't stop any of them? It was very hard for Zerg players, but what ended up happening was Zerg players were forced to adapt. I mean, they can't even take their goddamn natural. One base Zerg was even worse than it is now, which is almost unfathomable. And Zerg players basically got railroaded for month after month after month, and they sort of developed their macro mechanics quicker than Protoss players and Terran players. And really, if it wasn't for players like Liquid Jinro, fucking Terran players would have basically stagnated and had a huge time catching up. TT1 is an exceptional Brood War player. He's a guy who, even though he was around at the beginning of StarCraft 2, pretty much every foreigner, except for like Testy and G5 and Nyokin, every fucking foreigner except for those 3 guys like immediately switched to StarCraft 2 as soon as the beta came out, and like never looked back at Brood War until like Brood War Remastered came out. But it was very interesting because when everyone switched over, it was this mass exodus of, well, Brood War, the Koreans were fucking unbeatable, and it was almost like the foreigners didn't have any hope. If you fucking took a map off someone, a Korean, it was a huge, huge deal. But when all the foreigners switched over, it was sort of this arms race of, well, Jaedong and Flash and all those top tier Koreans are still over, you know, in Brood War. And a lot of people thought like, okay, well since Brood War, the Koreans were like so infinitely far ahead, we were never fucking catching up. This is great. This is like our opportunity to shine. And a lot of these old school Brood War guys were the best players at the beginning. And what do I mean by that? Is we see another fucking weird SCV pull. This was another thing. When maps are like, see, like this is exactly what I'm talking about. When maps are this small and weird, look at poor TT1 trying to go for a faster expansion here, as opposed to his like normal super safe robo build. And Jinro just pulled a few fucking SCVs and was like, deal with it. And when the rush distances were this close, it meant that you could do these weird little maneuvers, and it was incredibly hard to deal with. Terrans could sort of just pull a few SCVs, throw a little wrench in the plans, and it was so much harder to deal with because the game was just way more volatile in general. It was harder to scout. It was harder to expand because of the maps. We can see fucking Delta Quadrant here with rocks on the natural, and basically your quote-unquote natural is actually like a third that is just completely open and like a screens away from your opponent's natural. And TT1 is just going to sort of tuck tail here and take that inside base, which if you sort of consider like, well, why didn't you take that to begin with? Because it would have taken way longer to clear the rocks. The rocks on the natural really was just like a big fuck you to Zerg players, because Zerg is a race just has to have their fucking natural base. Everyone watching this knows that. Zerg has to be a base ahead, and of course that starts with a fast expansion. And the reason that I keep bringing up Zerg is because Zerg was the race that was really affected most by this time period. Like Protoss and Terran players, especially Terran players, had weapons. Like we can see here, like the double bunker wall in with salvageable bunkers. This was a play that essentially was completely risk-free, because if any point, like once TT1 finally gets a huge army to like break that shit, which like without immortals that's a lot of HP to rip through, Jinro just hauls ass, salvages, and retreats. And we saw Zergs being bunker rushed horrifically and just really abused by this. Almost every single ZVT started with the threat of a bunker rush, even if it was an illegitimate one SCV feigned bunker rush. God forbid if that fucking bunker went up behind your mineral line and you missed it, because all of a sudden it was hell on earth just to try to fucking keep your natural. And that really put players in a position where, yeah, it was very, very hard to take your natural, and it was way, way easier to be the guy making bunkers at the bottom of ramps than it was to be the guy figuring out how the fuck to take a natural base. So Jinro showing that he understands both the aggressive and macro side of the Terran coin, because we saw that build that he did on Lost Temple with a couple Banshees and the SCV pull. Yeah, that was a great little aggressive maneuver that sort of hits at a time where it's like, oh shit, he's here, and that's way more than I expected. That's how a lot of the games went in Wings of Liberty. Like, oh shit, he's here, and he has way more than I expected. But because of players like Jinro, Terran eventually became a race where it wasn't all about just cheesing and abusing and being insanely aggressive and doing these weird plays. Jinro showed that you can play macro Terran, you can play these safe expansion-centric builds, and Jinro was the cornerstone in pioneering this, and that's really where he's underappreciated in StarCraft 2 history. And because he sort of like retired in 2012, a lot of people forget about him and don't understand the impact that he had on the metagame. Remember the baseball reference analogy I made? These were two guys that go way, way back, two Brood War old heads. So even though both of them sort of, you know, stopped playing Star 2 around 2011, 2012, TT1 like went back to Brood War. I remember in like 2015, before StarCraft Remastered came out, TT1 was streaming Brood War with no cam to like 10 people. Like phenomenally good, like S-class fucking Protoss play. I was streaming to 10 viewers, and I was one of them. Like, this is a really cool guy that knows a lot about the game. And Jinro's just going to do a little bit of drop harass here. And hilariously, all the open airspace on Delta Quadrant allows him to get some Viking poke off. See a lot of Marauders coming out here. This was very popular in this era, going for more Marauder-centric type plays versus Protoss. Protoss players would like almost never open Twilight and Charge. Charge was 200, and I think it took longer to research too. What you saw was this, Colossus builds. Not really any Immortals made usually either, so this is the sort of stuff that was common, more Marauder focused, and then the Terran player goes right into Vikings. Notice how Jinro is continuously walking around with this medevac and pressuring. This is really inhibiting TT1 from breaking out of the contain. And Jinro, as soon as he drops in one spot, is looking to pick off Colossi here, rooting around with the Vikings, sharking around with the Vikings. And Jinro, even though he's down in supply, is sort of keeping TT1 on the back foot here. And it's just sort of a scary army here for TT1. And even though it looks like TT1 has like been contained all game and is way behind, and Jinro's like really dominating, there is sort of an oh shit moment where if TT1 can just break all this, if he can crush the contain, like Jinro all of a sudden has like a screen to run back to his base. He doesn't really have a lot of time to retreat. Now really probably what I haven't actually seen these games, but yeah, he's going to come down and try to break him here, and notice how the Colossus are going to get 2 volleyed, and holy shit, these frame drops. Not on my end for the record. And the Colossus are going to try to come through in monster mode, but Jinro's just going to kite back into the bunkers, and there's not really going to be enough sustained damage to completely clear this low ground. And like I was talking about earlier, the fucking streaming programs are not nearly as good. But even though all the Colossi died, this will be cleaned up. So this is exactly what I expected. Yeah, he cleans up the contain, but he loses all of his money units. And now we're going to see, hopefully, a fucking push across the map. Because a lot of times, Terran players, when they lose their whole army like that, there can be this oh shit moment where they can't like remax as quick as Zerg and Protoss. So a quick counter against a Terran that lost a big fight can surprise them. But looks like TT1 is just going to try to take some map control and take his third base. It would have been relatively hard to sort of like whip his dick in without a Colossus, and notice that's what he was waiting for. That and Charge presumably, but remember, no Charge, no Blink, no Storm, no DT. It's really hard to run up with slow Zealot, Stalker into like mass Marauder bunkers. So yeah, TT1 going into these robo units, he sees how Marauder heavy he's going, and because Marauders are armored units, they take bonus damage to Immortals, so he's going to switch into Immortals. And unfortunately for TT1, he's not aware of the fact that Jinro has a third base. Another cool thing I noticed about Jinro's play is like he's pretty liberal with the bunkers. A lot of people weren't like this, even though they salvaged for 100. There was really no reason not to do this, especially on maps like this. This was one thing that, along with many other factors, Jinro did well, along with dropping, along with macro, along with SCV production. There are a lot of elements to pioneering and perfecting macro, and remember, if I were to just show, this is like a really good game where the players have their shit together and are playing pretty well, but I could have shown you most of the other games from this tournament, you'd be like, Jesus, this is like pretty low level, like they're making a lot of basic mistakes. Even though this is an incredibly archaic game, to the point where the quality is like 480p and jittery, guess what, fellas? Like, this still had a significant impact on the history of the game. Force fields are going down, trapping a lot of the army at the third, and the Vikings instantly snipe the Colossus, and Jinro sort of flies around like, oh shit, he stopped making Colossus. SCVs are going to get pulled, and notice half of Jinro's army got segmented off, about half a dozen Marauders, and I think TT1 might run out of gas as we see about twice as many Marauders as we do Protoss units, and Marauder slow is going to make this retreat impossible, along with the lack of Mothership Core and Nexus recall. Jinro should just crush forward here, and TT1 GG's, and Jinro with the fist pump there, you gotta love that. So here we have Steppes of War, the cheesiest map in the history of StarCraft 2, the map with the shortest rush distance imaginable, the map that drove Zerg up a wall. And wow, that was a really interesting play. So what TT1 scouted there was multiple barracks, sort of, you know, usually that's like a, you would think obviously like a bio opener, and it could be aggressive, it could be non-aggressive, it could be safe, but it essentially means not tech. If you see another quick barracks, it's like, okay, he's playing kind of safe. And I love to see what Jinro did. Is he did a cancel mind game. He's like, oh yeah, there's my second barracks. And then when TT1 left, you fucking canceled it and made a factory. These are the sort of head games that we don't really see enough of anymore. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that scouting is a lot easier and the game is way more figured out. So showing your opponent information on purpose and then doing like a switcheroo on them, it's not really as popular as we once saw. For instance, in the third GSL finals ever, MC, and it looks like Jinro's might float this fucking factory out here to his third. What we saw was MC did this like bizarro build versus Jelizerg, where it was on Metalopolis, and he just basically pretended like he was going like, you know, like gate expand. And Jelizerg scouted the natural, and MC like made 4 gates in his main, and when the natural was almost done, he fucking cancelled it and 4-gated him and won. And literally for years, I would hear Tasis and Artosis just like speculate, like maybe it'll be a Nexus cancel, like if someone was playing a little weird or a little off. Well, maybe I'll do a Nexus cancel. It literally never happened again. That was the only time I've ever seen that in any fucking capacity. Now this stuff was way more common. You know, like, oh, like make a Stargate and cancel and go Twilight. Like, yeah, that exists, and you can still do stuff like that even though it's not as effective, but you really didn't see like, oh, I'm gonna fake an expansion, show it to you, and then all in. Like, it just was never really seen again. Taking the headset off a couple times to cough. Just know that I'm like not doing that into the mic. Taking the headset off and looking away. Fucking, ugh, gross. Looks like TT1's gonna go for 1 base Colossus here because fuck trying to take your natural on steps. And we really saw what I pointed out play out there very interestingly, where, yeah, Protoss was really sort of like, oh, I'm gonna rush straight up into Colossus. Like, if a good player might make multiple observers as they tech up into it. But I remember Idra and Artosis laughing whenever they were off racing. It's actually like this really weird PVT they played. It's really like the only Idra vs Artosis match online, which is a goddamn shame. But essentially what you saw was Idra I think was playing toss, and him and Artosis were laughing about the fact that players would just fucking go straight into Colossus. They would go like robo, but not make anything out of the fucking robotics, especially observers. Observers are insane, guys. They're so fucking good. And one thing newbie players never do is make enough observers. This was a common thing that we saw, where it was very bizarre for people to try to expand on Steps of War because it was the rush map. So people are sort of looking at each other saying like, who's going to blink first, who's going to try to expand, and neither player. I want to explain what Jinro did real quick. He actually floated his factory to his third so it couldn't be scouted. So if TT1 peeked in or went in with an obs, it would just look like a barracks play. And then he went fast Stargate tech behind it. And TT1's going to go for a bit of a bust here. Jinro just with a handful of weird 1-base beta-centric units, beautiful force fields, trapping the good old army into the Zealot fire. And unfortunately, it looks like Jinro is going to peter out here, and maybe one more warp cycle and an observer is because the Raven was out. TT1 lost the observer, and now this push is going to peter out. So this was another great example of like, oh, well, why would you, bother to even like focus the observer? Because people in this era didn't make more than one, even the really good macro players. And like I pointed out with the quip earlier, a lot of these motherfuckers didn't even make one observer. It was like, oh, going dark. Oh, I want the Colossus. It's really good. Well, like, you can't make it, so you have the Bay. I don't give a fuck. Okay, we see another follow-up push coming as the observer is out here. And the Colossus, I love this like 1-base versus 1-base shit where the Colossus is nearly invulnerable. And Jinro, it looks like he's barely going to hold at the top of his ramp, pulling a lot of SCVs. And right on the razor's edge here as we see 1-base versus 1-base knockdown drag out play, and it looks like TT1 might expand. Trying to chrono out Colossus. And this was just a hilarious, like, this has 2010 written all over it. Like the other games in this series, yeah, they're definitely Wings of Liberty games, but, you know, you could argue, like, well, I mean, they're macroing pretty well, they're playing intelligently, you know, like, oh, I'm going to make 2-gate observer. Like, this is the sort of safe stuff that we saw, like, up into, like, you know, 2011, 2012. But if you show someone this game, this is definitely, like, an archaic, early on Wings game with 2 one-basing players trying to kill each other, one of them going one-base Colossus, which is just hilarious. Another Colossus is out here because when you go one-base Colossus, it's essentially all about, like, rushing out and protecting your one Colossus. The Warp Prism, remember, was way worse in this time. Oh my god, Jinro's fucking salvaging his bunkers right when he gets attacked. That's fucking brutal. Well, at least he got 100% of the money back, right? And I would expect Jinro here to maybe focus the obs, but since he doesn't really have Banshees around, that was a silly statement. And Jinro, noticed he also tried to expand. I think he thought when he saw TT1's expansion, TT1 was done attacking. But because Jinro went for mass Marauders and TT1 went for a very Stalker-centric mix, yeah, TT1 is going to narrowly not break him again. This is just a very razor's edge game where throughout the entirety of it, Jinro has just been right on death's door. He's barely held 3 or 4 times now, and huge probe transfer there from TT1. You love to see that. A lot of like newbie players, he fucked it up, but at least he made the workers, right? A lot of newbie players simply would have just like, oh, I have 20 workers. I'll stop making them until I expand. And even though TT1 was less of a pioneer than Jinro was, he was certainly more of a macro player than a lot of other Protoss at the time. And a lot of action is going on as Marauders are going to dive in here, get the fucking Colossus, and then try to bean dip away from the Zealots. I gotta love this factory in the mineral line. You might be thinking, oh shit, he's gonna build a mine. Like, no, they didn't exist. It's gonna be a Hellion, and it's more of a cock block than anything. And vexingly, right when TT1 seems to get another foothold, he has to turn around. That's how the whole game has gone for TT1. This has been very frustrating, the Steps of War match. He's almost killed Jinro multiple times, and the Gorilla Terran is just using an incredible amount of moxie to hold on. A lot of workers still in the main here for Jinro. You couldn't even see how many workers you had above your base at all, much less it turning red when you were oversaturated. You literally just had to box your mineral line and like know how many you needed. It was very fucking hard. Lag, says TT1. So this is actually a really tragic moment in the game, because what's going to happen here is they're going to have to restart, and there was no resume from replay, so they crash out. I don't remember if it was TT1 or Jinro, but one of them crashes in a very back and forth close game, and these poor bastards have to sit here and fill time. So they have to do a rematch. And this is something that doesn't ever happen. It doesn't ever happen anymore because you have resume from replay. But if you're not aware, when shit like that happens and the game crashes, what happens is you fucking reboot StarCraft 2, you click on replay, you go to replay, you fast forward all the way until the end of the game when it crashed, and you do that take command thing, and you put Jinro on Jinro and TT1 on TT1, and this very interesting game where Jinro tried to hide information and sneak Banshees out on TT1, and TT1 did one base Colossus. It's not only been revealed, but it's been thrown out. And it's very interesting to note that this was the one map where you wouldn't want to regame. This is the map where you're going to have your sniper build, you're going to have your weird cheesy thing that you do. And I absolutely love Jinro's play last game where he showed TT1 the barracks and then hid the factory, floated it to his third, and rushed out a Banshee. This was the sort of deeply cerebral thing that we would see from players like Jinro, but not from other players. Because even though that might just seem like, oh, well, you know, all he did was cancel a building. No, between that and the float and the follow-up play, everything beautifully interacts with what it follows up with. And as far as TT1 goes, he did an aggressive one-base build that was perfect for the map, and he was right on the edge of breaking Jinro multiple times. And I've actually spoken to TT1 about that match that we just saw, and he was like, God damn, man, that fucking game on Steps was brutal. I felt like I had him. And if we watched that game, holy shit, I'm sure the audience felt like he had him too. Jinro was just about to die about 4 times over, and if TT1 hadn't lost that observer, then guess what? He would have broken Jinro the initial time, because pretty much like everything Jinro had except 2 Banshees was fucking dead. And the only reason that TT1 had to turn around was lack of observer. And considering this was a 2010 game, TT1 has made a remarkably high amount of observers and done a good job with map control and macro mechanics in general. And are we going to see the same build without a cancel here? Another factory float? Very bizarre, but you know, it's brutal to lose a game like that. It's essentially like, you know, it would be like game 1 of the World Series where you had both of your aces going and they pitch 4 innings and the game gets rained out. That's basically what we just saw, because it was a very interesting display of, holy shit, it's Steps of War. I wonder how people played Steps of War, because this is like the meme map of all meme maps. Like whenever you hear people laugh about Wings of Liberty and, oh, the level of play was so low and it was so goofy and stupid, like this was why. This fucking map was basically the epitome of that. So he's going to go for another factory float. Way less cool this time, unfortunately. Are they really going to do like really similar builds? I don't think Jinro, this is just a guess, I don't think Jinro will go for Banshee again. It just doesn't seem likely. I think he would have made a tech lab right by his starport instead of a reactor, but it's fucking 2010, who knows. Remember guys, it took people like a while to figure out the whole like Hellion Swapperino on the reactor that has become standard for a decade. You gotta remember, as we see an expansion being checked for there for TT1 and nothing being found, people couldn't even figure out like how to fucking hotkey eggs. It took Zerg players over a year to fucking hotkey eggs. Now it's completely standard. That's part of why these games in the Venomous Classic series are so interesting and do mean so much. This isn't just, oh, it's some dumb old final in bad quality. Only a cretin would think that. Only someone who started playing in Legacy of the Void and is bad at the game and sits there on Reddit and upvotes low effort memes and never upvotes OC. Those are the sort of people who can't appreciate the Venomous Classic series. Those are the sort of dim animals that you'll always see on forums being cunty and shitting on other people's play when they're never going to post their own replays. They're never going to contribute anything to the scene. Not an article, not a commentary, not a guy video, fucking nothing. Those are always the most loud, cuntiest people. We see here the factory was being used to scout as opposed to being hidden for information, and because the fact has so much health and Protoss players like didn't make mass stalker in the early game, even though hilariously we've seen quite a bit of mass stalker in the mid-early game of this series. The point is they didn't make enough stalkers to fucking like strike down the factory. Remember, everything was slower to ramp up in this time period than it was in the current day, because you had 6 workers. There was way more opportunity for you to sort of stick your foot in the door and do weird timings. That's one thing that I think is worth pointing out with that mid-game push that Jinro did on the Delta Quadrant game, where he pulled like 6 workers. You could do these like way sharper mid-game, like holy shit, here I am type timings. Remember, for the early part of this game's life, I think for like 8 months, the SCVs had 60 HP. LZ Gamer nicknamed them linebackers, so anytime Terran players could employ these SCVs in an aggressive manner, they would do so. I remember Artosis made this hilarious joke like 6 years ago where he said SCVs could have 1 fucking HP and people would still fucking pull them for these big bit-by-bit style attacks. But it's funny, we haven't seen a true bit-by-bit full SCV pull. Bit-by-bit was this really cheesy Korean Protoss or the Korean Terran in the early days of GSL who would do like exclusively ridiculous one-base all-ins, like Marine SCV all-in with boy pull and stuff. Even though Jinro has pulled like a handful of workers, it's been a sort of supportive nice little tech option that he uses to repair and pressure with bunkers, as opposed to like, here's my one base build, I'm pulling every fucking worker. Like, he literally overmakes workers intentionally to 30 or 32, so then when he pulls a handful, all of a sudden, wow, I still have an economy at home. TT1 has gone for a much faster expansion, and Jinro has gone for no expansion. So in the last game where they sort of blinked around the same time and both expanded, suddenly TT1 is in this position where he's like, well, here comes this big attack and it's Steps of War, so as soon as he moves out, he's at my front door. And remember, no charge. He's sort of worried about a drop in the main. He's worried about Banshee play, but oh crap, here comes everything. And again, Jinro really noticed how he targets down that Colossus immediately, gets those Viking shots going, and TT1 says GG, congrats. And look at Jinro, he's just so happy there in the bottom right. Pull your head out of your ass production, and they shake hands there. And TT1 just looks disgusted. He's just crushed by that fucking Steps of War game. Brutal. I'm sure he felt like he was going to kill him a bunch of times over, go on to the next game. And that was pretty much fucking Steps of War in a nutshell. And Jinro's just sitting there nodding with that tremendously strong chin of his. You just love to see this guy happy. This was one of these people who went out of his way to be nice to everyone and has still like been nice and saying good things about people and just positive, good person in general. So the concluding thoughts on this Venomous Classic series: Jinro was an incredibly talented player who had a significant impact on the development of macro in StarCraft, and I would say that without players like Jinro, you don't have peak MVP, you don't have peak innovation. These god-tier Terran players that were sort of considered untouchable in late 2011, 2012, you never get there without him. So there's Jinro, the Gorilla Terran. Love him. Sub for more, like the video.